Hey everybody. So I'm here because I think that in rooms like this, we get the most excited about the future of technology, like where it could go. And there's so many exciting places it could go. And it gives us all these amazing benefits, but I often think of this in the same way that we used to think about space. So when NASA first went into space, it actually took us 10 years, because we were so excited about pointing everything outward into space, to turn the telescope around and take a photo of Earth. And it was actually through that moment that the Environmental Protection Agency was later created. And I want to argue to you in the next 7 minutes, 6.5 minutes, that we are in a similar period with technology. We have been excitedly building all of this stuff to shove into the world, into the fabric of society. And we're so pointed outward that we haven't looked at what is it doing to us on the inside. So my background, by the way, for those of you who don't know, I was a design ethicist at Google, which meant I was studying how do you ethically manipulate 2 billion human animals' thoughts, because we have a responsibility in the way that these are designed. Let's ground it for a second. I want to argue to you that technology is the largest invisible force shaping culture in the world today. Here's why that's true. 2.2 billion people use Facebook. That's about the number of followers of Christianity. 1.9 billion people use YouTube every day. That's about the number of followers of Islam. These things have more influence over our daily thoughts than many world religions. We check our phones about 150 times a day if we're a millennial. From the moment you wake up in the morning and you undo your alarm, I've got you jacked in where thoughts start streaming into your brain that you didn't choose. And I basically control the thoughts that you'll experience all the way till you go to bed at night and you set your alarm again. So that sounds like a bold claim. I'm talking about mind control, but let's just take it to something simple. Many of you look like parents. Take your children. When they wake up in the morning, it has never been easier for 100 million teenagers to do this and see infinite evidence of their friends having fun without them. Photo after photo after photo after photo. It's always been true that our friends are having fun without us. But now I'm shoving that in your face and actually creating the social fabric that then a new generation is going to live in. And the myth I want to dispel is that the technology that we make is not neutral, and that's why this is a conversation about our responsibility we'll kick off in a moment. Because these technologies are not neutral. They're not just sitting here like hammers waiting to be used. They're designed with a deliberate goal, and that goal is to capture human attention. There's only so much human attention, so just like the environmental movement, there's a finite resource, and we're extracting it. So if I'm Snapchat, what am I going to do to hook your kids? I'm going to put the streaks in there. Streaks is the number of days in a row that shows, if you're a kid, how many days in a row have you sent a message to each of your best friends? So in other words, it's like taking two kids on 2 treadmills, tying their legs together with a string, hitting start at the same time, and they both have to keep running. Because if one stops running, the other falls down, and then that is the currency of their friendship that they just lost. It works really well. And then that's not enough to get your attention. I have to go deeper down the brainstem. And so I have to actually tap into their self-worth. I have to actually dose them with likes every 15 minutes and actually hold some back and then turn it into a slot machine so you check every 15 minutes. So what are we doing to ourselves? More importantly, where this is going is it controls the epistemic fabric, the political fabric, the way that we know the things that we know. Let me take a simple example. YouTube wants to maximize how much time you spend on YouTube. So what do? They say, let's autoplay the next video. So the video is done, and then you get to that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 countdown. The reason they did that, they only did that in the last 2 years, is because it works really well at increasing the amount of time you spend on YouTube. So now when you hear me saying this, you're probably thinking, OK, fine, so maybe this is eating into our sleep. Maybe this is making us a little less productive. Let me take it bigger. YouTube has been shown, because when it autoplays the video, which video is it going to play next? Do you know how it picks that? It tries to ask the question, what is the perfect next video that, based on everything I know about you, is going to keep you on here for the longest? So what you have is a supercomputer pointed at your brain, playing chess against the chessboard of your mind. What happens when Garry Kasparov plays chess against another person who's not Garry Kasparov? He wins because he can see more moves ahead on the chessboard. You can only see so many moves, so he owns it. When he plays chess against the computer sees more moves ahead on the chessboard than Garry Kasparov. But now you have a situation where 2 billion, 1.9 billion human animals every day use YouTube, and we have a supercomputer pointed at their brains playing perfect chess against their mind. And that's the reason why, when you wake up from the last 2 hours you spent on YouTube in a trance saying, what the hell just happened, you just lost at an invisible game of chess you didn't realize you were playing. The problem is that this is happening in languages that the engineers don't even speak. And YouTube has been shown to have a systemic bias towards divisive, outrageous, conspiracy theory videos. So it's been shown by a former YouTube engineer who works with us that if you airdrop a human animal and they land on a YouTube video, let's say it's the 9/11 news video, a regular 9/11 news video. After the autoplay, they're watching 9/11 conspiracy theory videos. Not because they're choosing them, but because YouTube's trying to figure out, well, what's good at keeping people's attention? Oh, these conspiracy theory videos are really good. And there's no one home inside of the system. There's no one at YouTube who wanted this to happen. There's no human beings who wanted this to happen. It's just the machines have run out of control. And so you have YouTube recommending 15 billion views of Alex Jones conspiracy theory videos. You have YouTube recommending if a teenager lands on a diet video, 2 videos later they're watching anorexia videos because that's what works really well at keeping teenagers' attention. And so you can think of this as we're polluting the social fabric. In the race to extract human attention and drill it out of kids' brains and drill it out of our society's minds to get polarization and outrage and all this stuff, we're polluting the common social fabric that we have. And so what we really need is a new humane technology movement. We need to do this differently. And we have to have a sense of what is our responsibility. Because for some of you in the audience, at some point, we're going to ask the question, after we've created a mental health loneliness crisis for kids, and we've created a public polarization crisis in democracy, who paid for all of this to happen? So we need a humane technology movement, and I hope we can kick off that conversation. I think it's also an issue that's actually hits your bottom line, because employees actually don't want to work at companies that they think are ruining the fabric of society. And that's actually been leading to a massive change so far in our work. In the last 2 years, Apple and Google both launching major well-being initiatives that are setting this in a different direction so we can compete in a race to the top for what's good for people. So I hope we can start that conversation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. How are you? I'm Jolene Kent. I'm with NBC News. I'm the business and technology correspondent. Let's hear it again for Tristan Harris. Fascinating. It's great to be here today. It's great to be back in Aspen. This is my 3rd time at the Aspen Fortune Tech Conference, and it has just been a real rewarding conversation every single time. And we're very happy to have our esteemed panelists here to pick up the conversation. But before we go, I need to set some ground rules about the town hall. We want to hear from as many of you as possible. We want to hear about your specific experiences, the concerns that you have, and what you're thinking about as you pursue the future with your company and with your ideas. So, a few things. There are mic handlers in the room. I think there's about 4 of them. So raise your hand and someone will come over and hand you the mic, and you can ask your question or make your comment. Also, when you do ask a question, please make it brief or give a brief comment. We don't want any commercials or lectures. You guys know what it's like to be in an audience. You know what it's like to speak. Just keep that in mind. And of course, I'll do my best to get to every single person in the audience here. If we do not get to you, we'd like for you to keep posting comments on the conference app. I think a lot of you guys have already downloaded that, so make use of it, post those comments, let us know what you think, and so we can keep that discussion going. All right, but before we get started, of course, this being Fortune, we collected some data. We partnered with SurveyMonkey to look at some of the things that are on your mind about privacy. So we're going to pull those up just about now. Here we go. So we asked about 7 or 10 questions, you may remember, and these are the few that really jumped out to me. First of all, the public. It sees significant risk in artificial intelligence. So you can see 73% are worried that artificial intelligence will be used to violate their privacy. That's 73%. That's a huge, huge majority. 72% see AI taking away more jobs than it creates in 10 years. 52% of respondents see technology as doing more to increase than decrease income inequality. And as we look at the jobs market today, you can start to see that play out. Next slide. The young and the vulnerable. Young adults, they're obviously spending more on mobile and social. Obviously, they're the most apt to see online services as essential to modern life and accept some risk to privacy that goes along with it. So let's take a look at some of these age groups here. 59% online services say online services are essential to modern life. 48% say that in the 25 to 44 range, and then the 45 plus range, 55% of respondents say the threat to personal privacy online is an all-out crisis. Now, this is what Tristan hit on just now in a major way, the tech trust deficit. So where are we lacking trust the most? Well, it turns out 58% of respondents say your bank. Or the trust is you trust your bank, but you don't trust the news sites that you use. 41% lack trust in Facebook, and 35% lack trust in the US government. So what you're seeing here is people trust Facebook less and the news sites less than they trust the US government. So there's a lot to digest here. There's a lot of good data. We have a lot more that we'll also share with you on the website as well. But first, to kick off this town hall, I'd like to go to Amy Bance, first of all. You're at the front row at Comcast Ventures. And one of the things that Tristan mentioned that our previous speaker also mentioned is culture. And being able to shape the culture and reshape that culture to rebuild trust in our institutions, in our startups. So at Comcast Ventures, how do you guys do that? And how is it different than the straight venture capital world?
You know, it's interesting. When I first took the helm of Comcast Venture and moved to San Francisco back in 2011, I didn't realize there were so few women in venture. I couldn't understand why it was news to anybody. I think in hindsight, I'm very fortunate to be in corporate venture. If you look at the 20 most active corporate venture arms, and they're more and more active all the time, I don't have the exact numbers, but I think it's 8 or 9 of them are actually headed by women. You know, that's impressive in light of the overall number of women in venture generally. And I think the reason, frankly, is our LPs, our parent companies, like Comcast, have been focused on the diversity issue for 20 years. And so they have created cultures that are much more hospitable, much more welcoming to women and to people of color, for that matter. And as a result, you know, it's a no-brainer to us to include women and diverse people on our teams, which we do. And you know, we, like all other venture arms, we're first and foremost focused on investing in good teams and good companies with good returns. But the result is, if you have women, I think, if you have women on your team, you actually end up investing in more women founders as well. So I'm with Crystal. I think that, or Krista, wherever she is, you know, I think we all owe it to ourselves to be aware of who is on our team and be very purposeful about recruiting more women and more diverse people onto our teams.
Thank you so much, Amy. I'd also like to call on Natalie Evans-Harris. Over here. Hi, stand up, please. Speaking of culture, building off of what Amy said, you are at Bright Hive now. You were also at the NSA for 16 years. Yes. And there is a culture there that we talked about off stage, about protecting privacy and data that is very different. Mm-hmm. And to build off of the culture of the people and looking at data and building off of Tristan's remarks here, who do you think is really responsible when it comes to individual privacy versus corporate profits? Is it just the company? Is it me, the individual? Where do we go from here?
You know, it's interesting. I think that if the question is who's responsible for protecting data and having that understanding, the consumer or the company, I really believe that we're at this point that it's on the company. Expecting individuals to understand how to protect their data is like expecting individuals to understand how to perform surgery on themselves. It's like expecting individuals to understand how the food got to the grocery store. They have to be able to trust that if you as a company are using their data, that you're using it in the way that they understood and intended it to be used, and that they're okay with that use. So as a community, how do we start to build that trust with individuals? At NSA, we have a concept called pull the thread. So we understand from the moment that a piece of data has been collected and entered our systems, its history, its life cycle, its use, the policies that govern that use, the ways that it's intended to be used, and the people are trained. You have to go through extensive training and understanding that as data stewards, you are responsible for making sure that that data is being used responsibly. So let's fast forward and let's think about in the private sector. At Bright Hive, in particular, I can speak to, how do you start to build that culture where you are using your products and your company to build trusted individuals? Because at the end of the day, we're going to continue to have these conversations and we're going to continue to have these problems as long as people don't trust. People don't trust Facebook, but they trust banks. You know why they trust banks? Because my money's in that bank, and when I go to the bank, I know I'm going to get money back. Robberies occur, bad stuff happens, but I know that my bank prioritizes protecting my money. People don't know that companies prioritize protecting their data. So two concrete ways that you can start to do that, and what we've started to do at Bright Hive, is really look at how do you incorporate ethical design in the development of your products. Tristan spoke to this earlier. We used the checklist manifesto, and we created a checklist that the product teams have to adhere to, think about, comply with throughout the development and the design life cycle. We're also transparent in our communications. So think about, as your company, how are you designing ethics into your product development? The second part is, how transparent are you in your business processes and communicating what data you use, why you use it, and how are individuals empowered in saying yes or no to what you're doing? That's a communication. You cannot have trust if you do not communicate and if you do not show and prove. So those are just two ways to think about it, but there's plenty more. And what's exciting is that we're having the conversation now, and we're having it beyond just compliance. Because nobody is talking and angry at companies because they're not compliant. Nobody's going, I don't want you to use my data because you aren't compliant with GDPR. They're saying, I don't want you to use my data because I don't know what you're going to do with it. The problem, you know? So I'll stop right there.
Thank you. To build off, I agree. I have one more slide I want to show you before we go to Jeff, the CEO of Foursquare. I don't know if we can pull that up right here, but to build off of what you just said, I mean, take a look at the data here. What's worse, government action or inaction on these topics? Well, the national population says inaction. 58% say it's worse. Only 46% say it's worse here at Fortune Tech, at Brainstorm Tech, but 54% say action is actually worse. So, Jeff, we have a lot to cover, but I know we had talked about regulation here. So, as a CEO of a company that deals with all kinds of very valuable data, and you work with other businesses to make sure it works for me, the consumer, when you see something like that and you think about the regulatory framework, what should come next? What should the political will be here in the US as we continue to see it build a little bit? We've seen California pass a new privacy law. We've seen GDPR.
So I'm CEO of Foursquare, but I'm also a dad of 3 young kids. And so I think about privacy and about tech addiction as well, which we'll come back to all the time. I think there are a few privacy issues that aren't getting enough attention in the media right now. So one is we are supportive, and I think most of the tech community, of a really high bar that consumers control their data, have the right to be forgotten. Everything should be transparent and opt-in based, and everything that Foursquare does follows that rule. But not everyone is acting like that. And so we encourage and support the GDPR regulation. One of the things that the tech community has to realize, though, is that we need ways to enforce privacy that don't just help the big giants dominate, but also support startups. So let me give you an example. We support the new California bill that has just been passed, and we want a higher standard for privacy, but the GDPR smartly asked all citizens to enforce privacy and report complaints to the European privacy regulator. In California, we did a very American thing. Instead of having a really strong privacy regulator, we invited every trial lawyer in America to sue every company over any possible infraction. And what happens is the big Googles and Facebooks can have armies of lawyers, but all the startups out there that have customer data that are offering free services based on advertising, they're all going to be devastated by an army of trial lawyers. And we all know how long it takes to settle these things, and that you pay all these lawyers to go away because it's a nuisance and takes years, even when you're right. So that's one thing that we're not talking about. We need national legislation that has a really high bar and a strong regulatory enforcement. And the other thing, and to agree with Natalie, we need global responsibility from tech leaders and the government. You saw in that survey that people don't trust the government either. Just this month, the EU Parliament called for an end to the privacy shield that 3,000 US companies depend on, because the new government in the United States canceled the ombudsman, we canceled the Civil Liberties Board, we defunded and destaffed it, and that was essential to keep the privacy shield going. So the government has a responsibility to start to respect privacy as well. The cloud law says, and everyone should be scared by this, the cloud law, which is the US law, says that anything that you keep in the cloud can be seized by the government without a warrant. And that is exactly why the EU is calling on the US to upgrade our privacy standards. So both the private sector and the US government in general have been out of line, and we need to ask for more.
Hemant, from General Catalyst, what's your response to that as you advise some of the fastest up-and-coming companies and their founders and how they staff out their boards and their executive suites?
Yeah, if I was to pop up for a second, if you reflect back on what Tristan said, life's pretty different just in the last decade, right? A lot of what social, mobile, and cloud has done. Just think about just the idea of, hey, we're 2 billion humans connected to and being controlled by a computer. It's sort of a scary thought. I believe we're actually in the middle of a pretty significant retooling of society. It's a 30-year cycle. Things like CRISPR and AR and VR and a lot of these technologies haven't even kicked in. So when you think about the kinds of businesses we're starting to build now, the importance of those, contrast that with if this was about games and about sharing pictures online when these last generation of businesses started that were dealing with some of these issues, building these companies with a sense of responsibility is something we have to amp up the dialogue around. So while we're building healthcare companies and education companies and improving people's financial health, we've got this notion of moving fast and breaking things. Well, maybe we should be moving on from that today. I think this idea of doing things that are good for business in the short term that are not necessarily aligned with the long-term interests of society, we can't afford to do that in these new businesses anymore. So when we work with founders in the boardrooms, a lot of the conversation is about how do you build teams that have their diverse point of view so you're keeping the long-term interests of society in mind? How do you build products that, as was said earlier, have the accountability, transparency, and explainability built into how AI is being used? How do you actually build algorithmic canaries in these products so you can understand when these products are starting to diverge from what's in the interest of society so you can course correct? A lot of what the examples of YouTube we talked about, we just didn't know, right? It wasn't ill intent. These are not bad people. I don't believe that's the case. But these examples are happening all over the place because we actually don't have measurement systems in these products either. So this next generation of companies, these new 2 decades, it's really important for us to be thinking about these considerations as we launch them.
What's one piece of advice that is kind of universal, Hemant, in what you tell the next generation of companies that you've got all that money in?
I mean, as I said, for me, it is always asking yourself, are the short-term decisions that are good for business the right thing for the long term of society? It's not enough to say, well, we'll first get there and become big and all of a sudden then have a culture that can survive starting to do the right things for society. It's really hard to unwind that. That has to be part of the culture from the beginning.
Thank you. Tristan, what do you think? To innovate, a lot of founders would say, I gotta go as fast as I can. We need to build out, we need to innovate, break things, and we'll figure it out later. I mean, do you think the thought paradigm here among founders, among investors has really changed? I mean, isn't the bottom line here making money?
Yeah, there's so many different issues that we're bringing up, and I love many of the comments that have been brought up. In climate change, there's this notion of the awkward years. If we were to stop and pull down all the carbon that we're emitting right now, we would still have about 30 to 50 years, I think, of basically bad weather getting worse every single year. Mm-hmm. So I often think of this as if we were to stop polluting on these other sort of environments, we still have baked so much polarization, so much privacy violations, so many things into the fabric of society with children that it's going to take a while to reverse, and that doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do. It means that we have to do it. It's going to take time. When the British Empire decided to abolish slavery, which was propping up their whole economy, you can think of some of these practices as propping up some of the speed, some of the growth that we've got. We like that growth, but then we're discovering, we don't want to be building our economy on top of that specific resource. I'm not saying attention is slavery, I just want to give an analogy. But when the British Empire decided to abolish slavery, they gave up 2% of their GDP every year for 60 years. So imagine you're in that period. You're in that 60-year stretch. You know that you've made the right change. You're making the turn. You don't want to do what you were doing, but you have to live through this transition, which is going to be uncomfortable. And I think we have to live through that transition now and acknowledge that it's not just going to be this instant, we all feel better kind of thing. I think on the privacy thing as well, that we have to actually acknowledge that there's an asymmetry in the power that the companies have over people have. And we have a tool in the legal framework to usually govern that relationship called the fiduciary relationship. An attorney knows more about the law, and they have access to privileged information about you, and because of that, we have to guarantee that they'll represent your interest. So if you think about an attorney asymmetrically being able to screw you, and you have a doctor who knows more about medicine and know about you, they could screw you too. If you then line up side by side, how much information does Facebook have to manipulate you compared to the other two? We like to say, imagine like a priest in a confession booth, except that priest is listening to 2 billion people's confessions, and they listen to your conversations outside the confession booth, and they track everywhere you go, and they've got a supercomputer next to them to process 2 billion people's confessions, to predict confessions you don't know you're going to make. And their entire business model as a priest is to sell access to that to someone else, to manipulate you. They don't make money other way. The answer isn't we don't want priests helping people. Maybe we do want that. The answer is we don't want priests with that business model. So we have to ask, how do we change the business models? And that's going to be an uncomfortable, awkward year transition, but it's really important.
Thank you, Tristan. That analogy really hits home when you think about it. Adam, what do you think?
Well, I think your comments are very thoughtful, but I want to issue a challenge to you and to the whole room. I think Wall Street, for example, thinks this is a big joke. The companies that are the biggest abusers of violating our privacy are doing really well. And if I were an entrepreneur looking to raise venture capital, I would say, it's fair hunting season. I'm just going to keep doing what I've been doing. By the way, the U.S. government isn't particularly interested in this, so I don't see anything changing.
Oh, you can keep that mic. What do you guys think? I mean, I'd like a reaction to what Adam just put forth, because as we've seen in stock prices, as we've seen with a lack of action on Capitol Hill, there is not necessarily a will. Does anyone have anything to say about that? Raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone. Right here.
Hi.
And could you introduce yourself and stand up, please? Thank you.
Judy Wade, and I lead a practice within McKinsey that serves startups and their investors. I don't think it's just on the public side. So if you're a startup, you're measured by how quickly you're growing users and how engaged they are. And until that changes, I don't think startups have any other incentive but to continue to do this. So the public side, the startup side, if the government doesn't care and that's what the investors are rewarding, and maybe there's a few that aren't, I don't think it's going to change.
I'm going to pass the microphone over.
I think that's really interesting. I see it.
What's your name?
Hi, I'm Sarah Jane. I'm with Collective Health. But previously, I've been with some very interesting, very fast growth social networks in the anonymous space, where growth was very much in that world, but it was short-lived. So I think most investors and founders are learning that that quick win and that quick growth can demolish a brand and kind of kill your lasting vision. So kind of a contrary point of view.
How can that incentive be created? Oh, we have a question. We have a speaker right here. What's your name?
Yeah, sorry. So my name is Chris Tolles. I run Topics, which formerly was a huge forum site. And to Adam's point, I think you're not going to get a legal. This is not going to be legally ever solved, because if you look at the John Roberts Court, freedom of speech is a corporate right. But I think that what I've experienced is if you get enough people complaining, it's going to it's really going to change the atmosphere of funding and the atmosphere of advertising and so forth. So the fact that everybody is talking about this shifts things over, but it won't be dramatic. It won't be this thing that the privacy advocates win. It'll just be something that, you know, there's hearings today in Congress where you've got Facebook and Twitter up against the wall, and, you know, and it's also not like the good guys winning. It's like a bunch of folks on super right-wing media trying to get a little bit more traffic from those guys. But I think that my experience is I have a peace treaty with 34 states' attorneys general, so I know of what I speak. You have to basically deal with the public opinion, and I think that that's shifting over. So I'm kind of on the other side of this. I kind of don't like what Tristan's doing, but I believe that's going to be a big force in the funding, and I'm as cynical as Adam is, but I think that that's already had an effect. You go to a VC right now and say, here's my privacy violation startup. They're going to look at you and go, thank you. Were you ever here? So that's my point.
Reaction to that? Yes. Tristan, sorry.
Just to respond to some of these things.
Yes. Let's get a response. You have a mic on.
I have a mic, so I'm good.
Great.
So what changes the system? I mean, we work full-time on systems change, and you have to see it as a massively funded system incentivized with the wrong things. That's why I brought up the slavery metaphor. It's not like that was easy. It's not like that was trivial. It's not like that was against, or the Wall Street back then would have funded that transition or said we should definitely do that. Literally, it was 12 people in a printing press in London. And they created representations of what the slaves were actually experiencing, and they actually brought to light the real true human cost of that bad thing. I'm not making a same equivalence here, but if you look at how this issue affects children, one of the reasons I'm optimistic is that especially all the tech leaders when it comes to the addiction and mental health, loneliness, alienation through children problem, many of the tech founders are starting to have children. It's actually now at the age in which the 32-year-olds who started Instagram, who are, by the way, my college friends from Stanford, as people are starting to have kids, they're actually caring a lot more. And I think that because this industry does care about kids and it affects their own kids, and investors can see it affects their own kids, you had two things last year. You had the Apple shareholders letter, basically putting pressure on Apple, saying you have a toxic product for children. That caused Apple to push this Apple Wellbeing Initiative. Google mirrored it with their own Wellbeing Initiative. I agree with Chris, and I really appreciate his criticism that these are lightweight gestures. These are not fundamental reshifts, but it has to happen. I mean, I think what I would love more time later to talk about is that this is actually an existential threat. I'm actually able to make that argument, but there's not enough time. So,
thank you, Tristan. In the back here.
Yeah, Michael Miller, PC Magazine. I'm going to go a different way, sorry. One of the things technology has historically done was raise living standards, raise productivity, improve things at a pretty good rate. That's what technology has historically done and improving all of that stuff. In the last dozen years or so, productivity growth has slowed tremendously, and median income has not improved at all. And is it part of the reason we're hearing a techlash, the fact that for so many people in our society, in fact, the benefits of technology in terms of their quality of life has not really improved? And I'm just going to ask that question.
It's a really good question. It's something we cover in the NBC Business and Technology Unit, is how wages have not moved. And what we see is increased automation. And we've been to factories where workers have actually been displaced thanks to artificial intelligence, plain old automation. But they've been displaced anecdotally into better paying jobs, more skilled work. But that is certainly not possible in a downturn. And I wonder, if you guys want to move into the AI, we can talk a little bit about that, about what that impact will be, especially as we approach what could be a correction of some kind in the future. We have a bunch of hands up. We're going to start here in the back.
Hi, my name is Jake. I'm with Growth Point Technology Advisors. I'm actually a believer in incentive systems, and so I think it'll be very difficult and it'll take a long time, and it may not go far enough in order to restructure incentive systems, especially for companies as big as Google and Facebook. So I wonder if we can ask the question about how do we take personal responsibility and how do we develop a curriculum for our kids and for people growing up on how to use these platforms in a responsible manner. I think, today the public sits there and says, well, I don't know how to handle all the settings on all the social networks I'm a part of, but it's pretty clear that some of this is going to be a personal responsibility, and we're going to have to educate people on how to do that and how to make that happen.
What's your reaction to that, sir?
Hi. Well, I have two reactions. The first is the largest invisible force is sex, not technology in the world. And it's true. My reaction is that we're pushing too much off on these companies. Every person in this room has the opportunity to vote these issues when they click on Google or on YouTube or on Facebook daily. And I find these analogies of slavery to be extremely abhorrent in our conversation. I think we should be much more careful and find more applicable analogies if we're going to advance this conversation properly.
You said you had a second reaction as well. Is that, did you
No, the first one was my, yeah.
So the reaction, something that I think about when I hear what you say there, is that a lot of the technology has become utility-like. And I've heard this argument from folks in the Valley to New York to DC and everywhere in between, is that they become so ingrained in the fabric of our daily lives that it becomes a responsibility onto the company, at least in some way, to try and manage and help alleviate some of the problems there. Do you have a response to that argument? It's something I hear over and over again as I travel across the country.
There are alternatives to everything. There is DuckDuckGo to Google, right? There's an alternative to everything. There are secure email systems. There are privacy-driven products. If this is something that matters to you, you'll vote with your usership, and we just don't see that happening in our society today.
Thank you. Yes? What's your name?
Marta Hall, president of Velodyne LiDAR, the technology that runs the autonomous vehicles. My reaction is that it is all about personal responsibility, but in order to take responsibility, you have to have the education and the transparency that's necessary to make your judgments. And I think that everyone should promote more transparency, more education on all of these topics regarding technology. Just like consumer reports changed everyone from looking at safety in cars, you'd look into consumer reports, you'd understand airbags, you'd understand seat belts. That's the type of thing that there needs to be more of, and we need to promote transparency and education for the public so that we can make the individual decisions.
Jeff, what's your reaction? Thank you. Hold on, your mic's not on. You want to take mine?
Okay. I think it's on now.
Okay.
So Foursquare runs experiments all the time on personal responsibility, and I think this is interesting. So we help thousands of other apps, whether it's Tinder or TripAdvisor or others, build real-world features that nudge people into the real-world experiences or that connect people based on their real world. Because remember, 90% of the economy and 90% of real life memories happen in the real world, not staring at screens. And so when we do things like with Tinder or TripAdvisor, where we offer the opt-in to understand your location and personalize the service and maybe tell you there's an offer or there's a piece of advice, or in Tinder starting to connect people because you both go to the same dog park and you both love the same cold brew cafe, and it's producing better human matches. We're seeing better match rates because you have something in common and it's getting you off your screen is the idea and nudged in the real world. So all this talk about tech is bad, tech has created problems, I think is correct, and I agree with Tristan, but tech can also be part of the solution. So we should all be challenging ourselves to build nudges that get people off their screens quickly and get them back into real world, whether it's timers or whether it's apps that you don't have to use but understand your context, which is the contextual computing that we work on. But the stat that's interesting for us is when we make it really clear and it's a separate opt-in, about 60 to 70% of people opt in, and 30 to 40% of people say, I don't want to share, for instance, my location. It's very easy, and if you don't opt in, you lose a service that's valuable, but it's your choice. And so when you give consumers that choice, and it's transparent and clear and not buried in some awful terms of conditions, then people do vote. And by the way, there are wonderful services that are supported by advertising that are free, that reach billions of people because they're free. We shouldn't demonize that, but users have to have control. And so that sort of 40% of people that are opting out, I think, is a vote. And the 60% who are saying, I love this service, I want to use it, and it's transparent that I'm opting in. I think that's the model, for how this should be, but a lot of these companies are just opting everyone in, and it isn't a clear choice, and that needs to get better.
We have 12 seconds, but we have time for one more comment. Please introduce yourself. What's your reaction to what Dan said here?
To your point about being the solution, so my name is Bari A. Williams, and I'm a legal and ops advisor for a company called OWL. There are a bunch of different things that I was just kind of filing away in my head. One, for the gentleman that gave the example about slavery, I personally was not offended by it, but I understood that it's an extreme example. But to that point, my grandparents were sharecroppers with third-grade educations. But they did that work so that I would have the opportunity to be in this room. And to bring up the fact that if tech is going to be a solution, then we need to think about social disparate impacts that it will have. So you need to think about, to the point about if you don't have people who are different from you helping you make decisions, you're not going to understand how those are going to have disparate impacts on marginalized communities, whether they be women, LGBTQ, Black people, Latinx, and those things need to be thought about. Additionally, when we think about AI and the implications of AI, what workers are being displaced there? Those are typically women, those are people of color, and they're typically women of color. So if we're thinking about the solutions, we also have to be prepared for the social disparate impacts that those things are going to bring. And we have to think about those proactively and not as a reactionary measure.
Thank you so much. We are completely out of time today, but Amy, I know you can make this very quick. Just one last comment from our panelist, Amy here from Comcast Ventures.
To tie up the discussion around exclusivity and diversity, you're absolutely right. To the extent that these tech companies, large and small, are having huge impacts, some acknowledged, some not acknowledged, on mankind and humanity, you need to people them, both on the cap table and on their teams, with all kinds of people, a cross-section of people, so that everybody has a hand in influencing the extent to which these companies are influencing the rest of us. That's all.
Thank you so much, Amy, and to all of our panelists. I feel like the conversation just got heated up, so as you step outside and listen to other panels, weigh in, talk to your fellow guests here and attendees. Thank you so much to Amy, Natalie, Jeff, Hemant, Tristan, and John Cohen of SurveyMonkey as well. Thank you all so much.